The forum was a crucible of humanity on auction days, where the unwanted, the unfortunate, and the utterly desperate were displayed like wares in a market stall. The blazing Roman sun beat down mercilessly on the stone platform where slaves stood in chains, their faces ranging from defiant to broken, from angry to resigned. The crowd milled below, merchants seeking laborers, brothel owners hunting for fresh stock, wealthy matrons looking for household servants, and the merely curious who came for the spectacle. Cassia stood among the condemned, her wrists rubbed raw by iron shackles. She was small for her 17 years, made smaller still by months of inadequate food and the systematic breaking of spirit that preceded every slave auction. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that might once have been called pretty. Before the bruises and the hollow-eyed stare of someone who'd given up hope, she'd been sold 3 times already. Each owner had returned her within months, demanding refunds, calling her defective goods. The slave traders had grown frustrated with her, reducing her price with each failed sale until she cost less than a healthy goat. The auctioneer, a corpulent man named Decimus who'd grown wealthy trafficking in human misery, grabbed her arm and pulled her forward to the platform's edge. His voice boomed across the forum, practiced and theatrical. Here we have a girl of 17 summers, reasonably healthy, literate. He paused, clearly struggling to find positive attributes, and docile, very docile, trained for household work. Starting bid, 50 denarii. The crowd's response was underwhelming. A few men glanced up, assessed her with cold eyes, and looked away. 50 denarii was already cheap for a slave of her age, but no one seemed interested. "Come now," Decimus tried again, his jovial tone growing strained. "Surely someone needs a servant. She can read and write. Rare for a slave of her station." "Why's she been sold 3 times?" someone shouted from the crowd. Decimus's smile became fixed. This was the question he'd been dreading. Minor issues with previous owners. Nothing that proper discipline couldn't address. "What kind of issues?" "She's barren," another voice called out. One of the slave traders who'd handled her before. "Can't bear children. Useless for breeding." And the last owner said she had night terrors that kept the whole household awake. The crowd's disinterest crystallized into active avoidance. Several people actually turned their backs. In Rome, a slave who couldn't produce more slaves was worth significantly less, and one with issues that disrupted households was essentially worthless. 40 denarii, Decimus said, his voice losing its theatrical quality. A bargain for someone who needs simple household help. No response. The crowd had already moved its attention to the next platform, where younger, more viable slaves were being displayed. 30 denarii. Decimus was sweating now, his grip on Cassia's arm tightening painfully. That's practically giving her away. Still nothing. Cassia stood motionless, feeling the weight of all those turned backs, all those dismissive glances. This was her 4th auction in 2 years. Each time the price dropped. Each time fewer people even bothered to look. She was becoming invisible. Less than invisible, because invisible things didn't actively repel attention the way she seemed to. 20 denarii. Decimus's voice cracked slightly. "Come on, someone must need a literate slave for copying work." 15, and that's final, someone offered from the back of the dispersing crowd. A brothel owner by the look of him. Decimus opened his mouth to accept. 15 denarii was better than nothing, when another voice cut through the forum's noise. "I'll take her." The voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout because everyone around would instinctively fall silent to hear it. The crowd parted, and Cassia saw him. A man in his early 30s, dressed simply in a white toga with a purple stripe that marked him as someone of significant rank. He was flanked by 6 Praetorian guards, their presence answering the question before anyone could ask it. Emperor Aurelius Maximus had been ruling Rome for 3 years. Ever since his uncle's death had thrust him onto the throne at age 29. He was known for being reclusive, for preferring military campaigns to political ceremonies, for making unusual decisions that confused the Senate but somehow always proved effective. And now he was standing in the forum slave market, apparently interested in purchasing the most worthless slave on display. "Caesar," Decimus stammered, dropping into an awkward bow. You honor us with your presence." "How much?" The emperor's voice was flat, disinterested, as if he were purchasing a loaf of bread rather than a human being. "For you, Caesar, she's—" Decimus's mind raced, trying to calculate. 100 denarii, a fair price for a literate slave of her age. Cassia saw several people in the crowd wince. 100 denarii for a slave who'd been about to sell for 15 was transparent exploitation. The emperor must have seen it too, because his expression didn't change at all. "Pay the man," he told one of his guards, who produced a purse without question. Decimus took the coins with shaking hands, clearly unable to believe his fortune. The emperor's gaze shifted to Cassia for the first time, and she found herself looking into dark eyes that seemed tired beyond their years. "Release her," the emperor commanded. A guard stepped forward with keys, unlocking the shackles around Cassia's wrists and ankles. The iron fell away, leaving behind raw, bleeding skin. She swayed slightly, unsteady without the weight. "Can you walk?" the emperor asked her directly. Cassia nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd learned long ago that speaking usually made things worse. "Then follow me." He turned and walked away, his guards falling into formation around him. Cassia stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. The Emperor of Rome had just purchased her. The unwanted slave, the barren girl, the one with night terrors and no value. She'd been bought by the most powerful man in the known world. One of the guards gestured impatiently. "Move. The Emperor doesn't like to be kept waiting." She stumbled after them on legs that felt like water, leaving behind the auction platform and the stunned crowd. Around her, the forum buzzed with shocked whispers. People were already constructing theories. Perhaps the Emperor had mistaken her for someone else. Perhaps this was some elaborate political statement. Perhaps he'd simply gone mad. Cassia didn't care about any of those theories. She was too focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on following the purple-striped toga through Rome's crowded streets, on trying not to collapse from exhaustion and shock. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, climbing toward the Palatine Hill where the imperial palace sprawled across the summit like a marble crown. Cassia had never been this close to the palace before. The palace gates loomed ahead, massive bronze doors decorated with scenes of military triumph. Guards saluted as the emperor passed through without breaking stride. Cassia followed, feeling the gates close behind her with a finality that made her stomach clench. They entered a courtyard filled with fountains and flowering gardens, then continued through corridors lined with marble statues and painted frescoes. Servants bowed as they passed, their eyes sliding over Cassia with curiosity and barely concealed disdain. She was painfully aware of how she must look, filthy, bruised, dressed in the thin, ragged tunic that was standard issue for auction slaves. Finally, the emperor stopped before a wooden door, smaller and less ornate than many they'd passed. He opened it himself rather than waiting for a servant. "This is your room," he said, his first words to her since the forum. "There's a bath through that door. Clean yourself. There are clothes in the chest. When you're finished, rest. Someone will bring you food." Cassia stared at him, unable to process the casual kindness in his tone. Emperors didn't give slaves private rooms, didn't tell them to bathe and rest, didn't purchase them in the first place unless they had specific, usually unpleasant purposes in mind. "I don't understand," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken in his presence. "Why did you buy me?" The emperor looked at her for a long moment, his tired eyes studying her face as if searching for something. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost sad. "Because I was once unwanted too." Before she could respond, before she could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway of a room that was larger and more comfortable than any place she'd ever been allowed to sleep. Cassia stepped inside on trembling legs and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as her knees finally gave out and she slid to the floor. Around her, the room was simple but clean. A bed with actual linens, a small table with a chair, a window looking out over the palace gardens, and she had absolutely no idea what it meant or what price she'd eventually have to pay for it. Outside the door, she heard the emperor's footsteps receding down the corridor, and with them went the last echo of the forum, the auction platform, the chains. She was no longer standing on a platform being sold, but she wasn't free either. She was something else now, something undefined, purchased by an emperor who claimed to understand being unwanted, living in a palace where servants looked at her with barely concealed contempt. Whatever came next, it would be unlike anything she'd experienced before, and she had no idea whether that was a blessing or a curse. Cassia woke to sunlight streaming through the window, momentarily disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath her. For a confused moment, she thought she was still in the slave quarters of her last owner. Then the memories of yesterday crashed back. The auction, the emperor, the impossible purchase. She sat up quickly, her body protesting with a chorus of aches. Someone had left a tray of food on the table while she slept, bread still warm from the oven, cheese, olives, and a clay cup of watered wine. Real food, not the thin gruel slaves typically received. Cassia ate slowly, savoring each bite while her mind raced with questions. What did the Emperor want from her? Why had he given her a private room, clean clothes, and food that would be generous even for a paid servant? In her experience, kindness was always a prelude to cruelty, a way to make the eventual betrayal hurt more. A knock at the door made her jump. A woman entered without waiting for permission, elderly, severe-looking, dressed in the fine clothes of a high-ranking palace servant. "I am Domitia," the woman announced, her voice clipped and cold. "I manage the Emperor's household. You will come with me." Cassia stood quickly, smoothing down the simple tunic she'd found in the chest last night. It was clean and well-made, better than anything she'd worn in years, but Domitia's expression suggested it might as well be rags. "The Emperor has given orders regarding you," Domitia continued, her tone making clear what she thought of those orders. "You are not to be assigned regular slave duties. You are not to be housed in the slave quarters. You are to be given freedom of movement within the palace grounds, though not beyond them." "I don't understand." "Neither do I," Domitia interrupted sharply. "But the Emperor's word is law, no matter how inexplicable. Follow me." She led Cassia through the palace, pointing out various locations with the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling an unwanted obligation. The kitchens, the gardens, the library, the baths, the servants' quarters, where Cassia would not be staying, as Domitia emphasized with barely concealed disapproval. Other servants stared as they passed. Some whispered behind their hands. Others made signs against evil when they thought Cassia wasn't looking. The message was clear. She was an anomaly, something that didn't fit the palace's careful hierarchy, and anomalies were threats. "Why does everyone look at me like that?" Cassia asked quietly. Domitia stopped and turned, her expression a mixture of disdain and something that might have been pity. "Because the Emperor purchased you publicly in the Forum. Because he's given you privileges that even loyal servants who've served for decades don't receive. Because you're clearly worthless, sold multiple times, barren, plagued with night terrors, yet he treats you as if you matter." She leaned closer. "People are wondering what spell you've cast on him, what unnatural hold you have over his mind. I haven't done anything. It doesn't matter what you've actually done. It matters what people believe." Domitia turned away. "The Emperor wishes to see you in his private study this evening. Until then, stay out of sight. Don't speak to anyone. Don't touch anything. And don't give the senators any more reason to question his sanity." She swept away, leaving Cassia alone in a corridor of marble and gold, surrounded by luxury but utterly isolated. The day passed in strange limbo. Cassia explored the parts of the palace she'd been shown, careful to avoid the servants who made their hostility clear with cold looks and turned backs. She found the library and spent hours there, running her fingers along scrolls she'd never be educated enough to fully understand, but could at least appreciate. As the sun began to set, a young servant girl, perhaps 12 years old, appeared at the library door. "The Emperor will see you now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Unlike the others, she didn't look at Cassia with contempt, just curiosity tinged with fear. Cassia followed her through corridors that grew progressively more private, until they reached a door guarded by 2 Praetorian soldiers. The girl knocked, received permission to enter, and gestured for Cassia to go inside alone. The Emperor's private study was smaller than Cassia expected, lined with maps and scrolls, rather than the elaborate decorations that filled other parts of the palace. Emperor Aurelius stood at the window, looking out over Rome as the city's lights began to flicker to life in the growing darkness. He didn't turn when she entered. "Close the door." Cassia did, her heart pounding. This was it, whatever he actually wanted from her, whatever price he expected her to pay for yesterday's rescue. "I imagine you have questions," he said, still facing the window. "Many, Caesar. Ask them." The invitation was so unexpected that Cassia stood silent for a moment, struggling to organize her thoughts. Finally, she found her voice. "Why did you buy me?" "I told you." "Because I was once unwanted too." "That's not an answer. That's a riddle." He turned then, and she saw a flash of something, amusement, approval, cross his face. Most slaves wouldn't dare tell an emperor his answers are inadequate. Most slaves haven't been sold 4 times and given up caring whether they survive the next day. The emperor studied her for a long moment. Sit. This conversation will take time. There was only one chair besides his own, an unprecedented offer of equality. Cassia sat carefully, feeling the weight of protocol she was probably violating. Emperor Aurelius moved to a cabinet and poured 2 cups of wine. He offered one to Cassia, who took it with trembling hands. Emperors didn't share wine with slaves. The world was becoming stranger by the moment. I was 9 when my uncle became emperor. He began, sitting in his own chair. My father had just died. My mother remarried quickly. A political alliance. Her new husband didn't want me. I reminded him that I existed as evidence of her previous marriage, previous loyalty. So he convinced my mother to send me away. To where? The military. A frontier garrison in Germania, as far from Rome as they could send me without outright exile. I was 9 years old, and I was unwanted. An inconvenience. A problem to be solved by removal. He took a long drink of wine. I spent the next 20 years in various military camps, fighting Rome's enemies, and trying to understand why my own family couldn't stand the sight of me. But you became emperor, because my uncle had no legitimate heirs, and I was technically next in line by blood. The Senate couldn't prevent it without causing civil war. So they crowned me, and now I rule an empire while remembering what it felt like to be that 9-year-old boy nobody wanted. Cassia began to understand. So when you saw me on that platform, I saw myself rejected, unwanted, priced lower and lower until even that wasn't enough to make anyone take a chance. He met her eyes. I don't know what I can offer you besides safety and a strange kind of freedom. I'm not going to touch you. I'm not going to force you into service. I have no use for another slave, and even if I did, I remember too clearly what it feels like to be used. Then what am I supposed to do here? Whatever you want. Read in the library. Walk in the gardens. Learn a trade if you wish. Just exist. Safely. Without fear of being sold again or returned as defective merchandise. He paused. I know it's strange. I know the palace is already full of rumors about my sanity. But I have power, and if I can't use it to save one person from the rejection I remember so clearly, what's the point of having it? Cassia stared at him, trying to process this impossible kindness from the most powerful man in Rome. People are calling me a witch, saying I've bewitched you. People say many things. I stopped caring about palace gossip around the time I realized half the Senate wants me dead regardless of what I do. The servants hate me. The servants hate change, and anything that disrupts their carefully maintained hierarchy. They'll adjust or they won't. Either way, you have my protection. He stood, moving back to the window. You can go. Come back tomorrow evening if you want to talk. Or don't. The choice is yours. Cassia stood slowly, still clutching the wine cup. Caesar, thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't discovered the cost of my protection. At her alarmed expression, he added, not that kind of cost. I mean the isolation, the whispers, the knowledge that an entire palace full of people is watching you, judging you, waiting for you to prove their theories right. That's the price of being connected to power, even tangentially, even as nothing more than an emperor's strange act of charity. As Cassia left the study and made her way back through the darkened corridors to her room, she understood what he meant. Servants fell silent as she passed. Guards watched her with undisguised suspicion. Somewhere in the distance she heard laughter. At her expense, probably. She was safe from being sold, safe from being returned as defective, safe from starvation and abuse. But she was utterly, completely alone in a palace full of people, just like the emperor who'd saved her. 2 unwanted souls existing in parallel isolation, connected only by the understanding of what it meant to be rejected by the world. Cassia entered her room and closed the door, leaning against it as she had the night before. She still didn't know if this was a blessing or a curse. But for the first time in years, she had something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Choice. And perhaps in time, she'd figure out what to do with it. 3 months passed in the palace, and Cassia learned to exist in the strange space the emperor had created for her. She spent her days in the library, copying texts to occupy her hands and mind. She walked the gardens in early morning when fewer servants were about. She attended evening conversations with Emperor Aurelius, where they spoke of philosophy, history, and the weight of power neither had asked for. The palace servants continued to avoid her, but their hostility had evolved into grudging acceptance that she wasn't going anywhere. The senators, however, were another matter. Cassia heard the whispers. They called the emperor mad, said he was unfit to rule, pointed to his obsession with a worthless slave girl as evidence of deteriorating judgment. But Cassia noticed something else. The emperor was suffering. It started with small observations. The dark circles under his eyes that grew more pronounced each week. The way his hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was watching. The carefully controlled movements that suggested someone managing constant pain. One night, Cassia arrived at his study for their usual conversation and found him absent. The guards at the door looked uncomfortable. "The emperor is indisposed," one said. "You should return to your quarters." But Cassia heard something then. A sharp intake of breath from deeper within the emperor's private rooms. A sound of pain. "Is he hurt?" "Return to your quarters," the guard repeated firmly. Cassia stood there for a moment, weighing obedience against instinct. Then she did something she'd never done before. She disobeyed a direct order. She pushed past the startled guards and through the study into the chambers beyond. The guards called after her, but didn't physically stop her, perhaps uncertain how to handle this breach of protocol from someone in her ambiguous position. She found the emperor in his bedchamber, collapsed against the wall, his face pale and twisted with pain. His tunic was pulled aside, revealing an old scar across his chest, except the scar was glowing, actually glowing, with a sickly green light that pulsed in rhythm with his labored breathing. "Get out," he gasped when he saw her. "Don't. You shouldn't see." But Cassia was already moving toward him, her years of fear burned away by simple human instinct to help someone suffering. She knelt beside him, ignoring his protests. "What is this?" she asked, reaching toward the glowing scar. "Don't touch it." His hand caught her wrist. "It's cursed. Divine punishment. If you touch it, if I touch it, what? I'll be cursed too?" Cassia laughed bitterly. "Everyone already thinks I'm cursed. What's one more?" She pulled her wrist free and pressed her palm against the scar. The glow intensified for a moment, and she felt heat, not burning, but like touching something that existed on a different plane than normal matter. The emperor cried out. Then the glow began to fade, not disappear, but diminish, as if her touch was drawing it out, diffusing it. The emperor's breathing eased. The tension in his muscles relaxed. When Cassia finally pulled her hand away, the scar had returned to looking ordinary. Old, healed, but no longer radiating that unnatural light. "How did you do that?" the emperor whispered, staring at her with something between awe and fear. "I don't know. What is that scar?" He was silent for a long moment, clearly debating whether to answer. Finally, he slumped back against the wall, exhausted. "It happened during the Germanic campaigns. 7 years ago, before I became emperor, we'd captured a town harboring rebels, Romans who'd fled to live among the tribes rather than face justice." His voice was distant, remembering. "My commander ordered executions, all of them. Men, women, children. Standard procedure for traitors. But you didn't agree. I was 25 years old and thought I knew better. I argued, said we should spare the children at least, let them be sold into slavery rather than killed. The commander told me to shut up and follow orders." He touched the scar carefully. "So I did something incredibly stupid. I refused. I told my men to stand down. What happened? The executions happened anyway. I couldn't stop them. I didn't have enough men, wasn't senior enough to override orders. All I did was split the unit and create chaos. 3 of my men died. The children I'd tried to save were killed anyway. And when the rebels learned what happened, that a Roman officer had tried to show mercy, they attacked our camp that night." The emperor's hands clenched into fists. "They were slaughtered. We had superior training, superior weapons. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. And I led it. I killed men who'd attacked because they'd heard a Roman had tried to show mercy and thought maybe we could be reasoned with. I killed their hope. And the scar? The rebel leader. He was the last one standing. He had a spear blessed by their priest. He drove it through my chest while dying and told me the gods would punish me for my mercy, that I'd carry the weight of those children I'd failed to save. That pain would haunt me until I atoned or died." The emperor laughed bitterly. Everyone thought he was just raving, but the wound wouldn't heal properly. Every few nights it burns like the spear is still in my chest, like the curse is reminding me that mercy without power is meaningless. Cassia sat back, processing this. "That's why you bought me. Not just because you understand being unwanted, but because you're trying to atone, trying to prove that mercy can mean something if you have power to make it stick. Perhaps, or perhaps I'm just a fool." He met her eyes. "But you touched the scar and it faded. That's never happened before. Every physician, every priest, every healer, nothing helps. But you touched it, and the pain lessened. How? I don't know. Cassia looked at her palm, expecting some mark, but her hand looked the same as always. Maybe it's because I understand curses. I've lived with everyone calling me cursed for being barren. Maybe that gives me some resistance. Or maybe your rebel leader's god isn't as powerful as he thought. The emperor pulled his tunic back into place. Or maybe you're exactly what the palace whispers say. Something more than a simple slave girl. For a moment, Cassia saw fear in his eyes. Real fear, directed at her. If you want me to leave? No. The word came out quickly, almost desperately. No, I need to think. To understand what this means. He stood slowly, testing his strength. Go back to your quarters. We'll talk tomorrow. And Cassia. He caught her arm as she turned to leave. Thank you. Whatever you did, whatever it means, thank you. Cassia left the emperor's chambers and walked back through the palace in a daze. The guards watched her with new wariness. Servants she passed actually moved away, pressing themselves against walls to avoid being near her. Word had already spread. When Cassia reached her room, she found Domitia waiting outside the door. What did you do to him? The elderly woman demanded. I helped him. He was in pain. The emperor has private physicians for pain. He doesn't need interference from a slave whose previous owners all returned her as defective. Domitia stepped closer. Listen to me, girl. I don't know what you are or what your purpose is, but I've served this palace for 40 years, and I know when something doesn't belong, you're going to bring trouble. Maybe you already have. I didn't ask to be brought here. It doesn't matter what you asked. You're here now, and the emperor has shown you favor that makes no sense. People are noticing, questioning, and when people question an emperor's judgment, bad things happen. Domitia's expression shifted, showing something that might have been genuine concern. I'm warning you because I don't want to see another civil war. If you care about him at all, you'll leave. Convince him to send you away before the senators use you as evidence of his unfitness to rule. She swept away before Cassia could respond. Cassia entered her room and sat on the bed, her mind spinning. In one evening, she'd discovered the emperor carried a cursed wound, had somehow eased his pain, and had become an even bigger target for palace intrigue. She should leave. Domitia was right about that. Her presence was dangerous for the emperor, was giving his enemies ammunition. But when she thought about leaving, about going back to being unwanted and alone, something in her chest tightened with loss. For 3 months, she'd had conversations with someone who treated her as human. She'd had safety, food, freedom to exist without fear. She'd had something that felt almost like belonging. And now she'd touched a cursed scar and made it fade, which meant she was either more dangerous than anyone realized, or more valuable. Either way, leaving was probably the right choice. But right choices and possible choices weren't always the same thing. Cassia lay back on her bed, knowing tomorrow would bring new complications, new dangers, new reasons why an unwanted slave girl should never have been brought into the heart of imperial power. But for tonight, she was still here, still safe, still connected to someone who understood what it meant to be rejected, and she wasn't ready to give that up. Not yet. The palace transformed overnight. What had been whispers became open accusations. What had been suspicious glances became outright hostility. By morning, everyone knew that the cursed slave girl had entered the emperor's private chambers and done something, though no one knew exactly what. The senators seized the opportunity. 3 days after Cassia had touched the glowing scar, Emperor Aurelius summoned her to the throne room, not his private study, but the formal chamber where he received petitions and rendered judgment. Cassia arrived to find the room packed with senators, military commanders, and high-ranking officials, all watching her with expressions ranging from contempt to calculation. The emperor sat on his throne, his face carefully neutral, but Cassia could see the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't a conversation, it was a trial. Senator Marcus Brutus stepped forward, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades accumulating power. Caesar, we come before you with grave concerns about the stability of your reign. Do you? The emperor said flatly. We do. For 3 months you have harbored a slave of questionable origin and no value. You have given her privileges that exceed those of loyal servants who've served Rome for decades. You have been seen speaking with her privately, regularly, in ways that suggest undue influence. I speak with many people privately. That's part of ruling. But you don't give many people unrestricted access to your chambers. You don't purchase them publicly in the forum for 10 times their worth. You don't defend them when the entire palace questions your judgment. Brutus gestured toward Cassia. This girl is either a witch who has bewitched you, or you are unfit to rule. Either way, action must be taken. The other senators murmured agreement. Cassia felt the weight of their collective hostility like a physical pressure. What action do you propose? The emperor asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Her execution, immediately, to prove that you are not under her influence, that you can make rational decisions in Rome's interest. Brutus's smile was cold. Unless, of course, you cannot bring yourself to do so, in which case, we must question whether you should continue to hold the throne. Cassia's blood ran cold. This wasn't really about her. This was a test, a trap designed to force the emperor into a position where any choice he made would weaken him. Execute her, and he proved their point that she'd been a mistake. Refuse, and they'd use it as evidence of unfitness to rule. You're asking me to execute someone who has committed no crime, the emperor said carefully. We're asking you to remove a threat to Rome's stability. The people are talking, Caesar. They see an emperor who spent a fortune on a worthless slave, who gives her freedom while loyal Romans suffer. They see weakness, irrationality, divine disfavor. The people see what you tell them to see, Brutus. Perhaps. But can you afford to ignore what they believe? Brutus moved closer to the throne. You were always an outsider, Caesar. The nephew who was sent away, who returned only because there was no one else. The Senate accepted you because we had no choice. But we can unmake that choice if you prove unworthy of the throne. It was treason, stated so openly that Cassia couldn't believe Brutus had the audacity to voice it. But the other senators didn't protest. They watched the emperor, waiting to see how he'd respond to this naked challenge. Emperor Aurelius stood slowly, his hand moving to the sword at his side. You forget yourself, Senator. I am not some boy you can intimidate with veiled threats. And you forget that emperors rule only with the Senate's support. We made you. We can unmake you. Brutus gestured to the assembled officials. Execute the girl and prove you can be rational, or refuse, and we'll have all the evidence we need that you're unfit to lead Rome. The emperor looked at Cassia then, his dark eyes meeting hers. In that moment she saw his dilemma clearly. He could save her and lose his throne, which meant civil war, bloodshed, and chaos for Rome, or he could execute her and maintain power, but prove that mercy was always secondary to political necessity. Either way, the lesson he'd learned in Germania, that mercy without power was meaningless, would be proven true again. Cassia made her decision before the emperor could speak. I'll go willingly, she said, her voice carrying across the throne room. If my death will end this conflict, if it will prove the emperor is not bewitched or weak, then I offer myself. Cassia, no, the emperor began. You gave me 3 months of safety, she interrupted, speaking to him directly despite the breach of protocol. 3 months of being treated as human. That's more than I expected from life. More than I deserved, probably. If I can repay that by dying so you can keep ruling, then it's a fair trade. That's not how this works, isn't it? She turned to face Brutus and the assembled senators. You want proof the emperor is rational? Here it is. I'm a slave. I have no family, no position, no value to anyone except him. My death costs Rome nothing. If killing me preserves stability and prevents civil war, then it's the logical choice. Brutus smiled, clearly pleased that she was making this easy. The girl speaks wisdom, a rare quality in a slave. She speaks sacrifice, the emperor said coldly. And if you think I'll execute her simply because you've manufactured a crisis around her existence, you understand nothing about me. Then you choose her over Rome? I choose not to be blackmailed by senators who think they can dictate policy through threats. The emperor descended from his throne, his hand still on his sword. You want civil war, Brutus? You want to test whether the legions follow you or me? Because that's what you're threatening, and I think we both know how that would end. The throne room fell silent. Several senators shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having expected the emperor to call their bluff so directly. But Brutus didn't back down. The legions follow strength, Caesar. And harboring a cursed slave girl while Rome starves for leadership is not strength. It's weakness. It's the behavior of a man who values personal sentiment over Rome's needs. Or it's the behavior of a man who remembers that Rome is made of people, not abstract principles. That mercy matters. That protecting the powerless is what separates civilization from barbarism. Pretty words. But words don't feed hungry citizens or defend borders or maintain order when senators lose faith in their emperor's judgment. The emperor drew his sword, not in threat, but in demonstration. This is how I defended Rome's borders for 20 years. This is how I earned the throne you now claim you can take away. And this, he drove the blade into the marble floor with enough force to make it ring, is my answer to your ultimatum. I will not execute an innocent person to satisfy your political games. If you want civil war, bring it. But know that I won't go quietly back to exile because you've decided a slave girl is a convenient excuse to challenge my reign. For a long moment, no one moved. The sword stood upright in the cracked marble, a line literally drawn. Then Brutus played his final card. Very well, Caesar. If you won't defend Rome from this threat, we will. He gestured to guards Cassia hadn't noticed before. Not Praetorian guards loyal to the emperor, but private security hired by the Senate. Take the girl. Execute her in the Forum. Let Rome see that the Senate still protects them, even when their emperor will not. The guards moved toward Cassia. The emperor moved to intercept them, but more guards appeared, surrounding him. Not attacking, that would be open treason, but blocking him, preventing him from interfering. This is mutiny, the emperor said, his voice deadly quiet. This is necessity, Brutus replied. When an emperor proves unfit, the Senate must act. History will judge whether we were right. Cassia felt hands grip her arms, pulling her toward the throne room's exit. The emperor struggled against the guards surrounding him, but there were too many, and they were carefully avoiding any action that would constitute direct assault on his person. Cassia, he called out. Don't let them... It's all right, she called back, even though it wasn't all right, even though she was terrified. It's all right. This is how it has to be. But as they dragged her from the throne room, she saw the emperor's face, the rage, the helplessness, the same expression she imagined he'd worn in Germania when his mercy had failed and his men had died, because he'd been too weak to make his choices matter. They took her to the dungeons beneath the palace, threw her into a cell that smelled of old fear and despair. The door slammed shut, leaving her in darkness. Tomorrow, they would execute her in the Forum. They would call it justice, would frame it as the Senate protecting Rome from an unfit emperor's poor judgment, and the emperor would have to watch, powerless to stop it without triggering the civil war that would kill thousands. Cassia sat in the darkness and thought about mercy, about power, about the impossible choices people faced when they tried to be good in a world built on cruelty. The emperor had tried to save her, had given her 3 months of safety, of dignity, of being treated as human. Now she would die to save him from the consequences of his own kindness. It seemed fitting somehow. A curse recognizing a curse. A rejected girl dying to protect the man who'd rejected rejection itself. In the darkness, Cassia closed her eyes and waited for dawn. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly at once. Cassia spent the night in the cell, listening to the distant sounds of the palace preparing for what the Senate was calling a public restoration of order. She heard guards moving, heard whispers from servants carrying supplies, heard the city beyond the palace walls beginning to stir with the news that something significant was about to happen in the Forum. No one came to speak with her. No final meal, no priest offering empty comfort, no explanation of what form her execution would take. She was simply left alone in the darkness, waiting. When they finally came for her at mid-morning, the guards were different from the ones who'd arrested her. Older, harder, men who'd clearly done this before. They bound her wrists with rope rather than chains and led her up from the dungeons through corridors she'd never seen, avoiding the main palace halls. "Where's the emperor?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. "Confined to his chambers," one guard replied. "The Senate thought it best he not witness this. For his own protection," they said. They were preventing him from interfering. Cassia felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that he wouldn't have to watch. Disappointment that she'd face this alone. They brought her to the Forum through a side entrance, emerging into blinding sunlight and an already gathering crowd. Word had spread quickly. The cursed slave girl who'd bewitched the emperor was to be executed. People had come from across the city to watch, their faces showing the whole range of human reaction to spectacle. Curiosity, righteousness, bloodlust, pity. A platform had been erected in the center of the Forum, and on it stood something that made Cassia's blood freeze. A pyre. Not a simple execution then. They were going to burn her. Trial by flame, judgment by fire. The old way of proving divine favor or disfavor. Senator Brutus stood on the platform, surrounded by other senators and priests. He raised his hands for silence as the guards brought Cassia forward. "Citizens of Rome!" His voice boomed across the forum. "We gather today to cleanse our city of a threat that has infiltrated the very heart of our empire. This girl, this slave of no worth or value, has used dark arts to bewitch our emperor, to cloud his judgment, to turn him against the Senate and the people he has sworn to protect." The crowd murmured. Some shouted agreement, others looked uncertain. "We ask the emperor to remove this threat himself," Brutus continued, "to prove that he was not under her influence. He refused. He chose her over Rome, sentiment over duty, personal attachment over the good of the empire." He gestured toward Cassia. "But the Senate will not abandon Rome. We will protect you, even when your emperor will not." More shouts of approval now. The crowd was being worked into the proper mood, righteous, fearful, ready to witness violence in the name of protection. "Therefore we submit this girl to trial by flame. Let the gods themselves judge whether she is innocent or guilty. If she is pure, the fire will not touch her. If she is cursed, if she has used witchcraft to corrupt our emperor, the flames will consume her and Rome will be cleansed." It was brilliant politics. If Cassia burned, which she would, because fire consumed everyone, they could claim the gods had judged her guilty. If by some miracle she survived, they could claim divine intervention had saved her and pivot their narrative accordingly. Either way, they won. The guards untied her wrists and positioned her at the base of the pyre. The wood had been soaked in oil. She could smell it, sharp and acrid. This wouldn't be a slow death. Once lit, the flames would spread quickly. Cassia looked out at the crowd, trying to find something to focus on, some point of calm in the chaos of her final moments. Instead, she saw familiar faces scattered through the gathering. Domitia, watching with an expression that might have been regret. Some of the palace servants she'd passed in corridors. The young girl who'd summoned her to the emperor's study, tears streaming down her face. And at the very back, barely visible, a figure in a hooded cloak that she would have recognized anywhere by his bearing alone. The emperor had come. Despite the Senate's orders, despite the guards who were supposed to confine him, he'd found a way to witness this. "Have you any final words?" Brutus asked Cassia, the ritual question that protocol demanded. Cassia took a breath, her mind racing. She could denounce Brutus, could call out the political manipulation, could try to turn the crowd against the Senate. But what would that accomplish? It would only make the emperor's position worse, would prove that she'd been influencing him, would justify everything Brutus had claimed. Instead, she spoke quietly, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. "I'm not a witch. I'm not cursed. I'm just a girl who was unwanted until someone chose to see me as human. If the gods judge that worthy of death, so be it." Brutus nodded to the priests, who began their invocations. Words about divine judgment, about purity and corruption, about letting the gods' will be made manifest. Empty theater, but the crowd hung on every word. Then one of the priests stepped forward with a torch. "Let the trial begin," Brutus intoned. The priest touched the torch to the oil-soaked wood. Flames erupted immediately, racing up the sides of the pyre with terrifying speed. Heat washed over Cassia in a wave, and she heard the crowd gasp and press backward. This was it. The end she'd somehow always known was coming, from the moment she'd been returned by her first owner, from the moment she'd stood on the auction block being rejected by everyone who looked at her. The world had finally found a way to dispose of her permanently. She closed her eyes, bracing for the pain. But the pain didn't come. The heat intensified around her, but it didn't burn. Cassia opened her eyes and saw flames surrounding her, rising higher than her head, consuming the wood of the pyre. But where the fire touched her, it simply parted, flowing around her like water around a stone, close enough that she could feel its warmth but not close enough to harm. The crowd's gasps turned to shouts. The priests backed away. Even Brutus looked shaken, his political calculation disrupted by something that shouldn't be possible. Cassia stood in the center of the inferno, untouched, as confused as everyone watching. She could feel the heat, could see the flames, could hear the wood cracking and collapsing around her. But her skin didn't burn. Her clothes didn't catch fire. She remained whole and unharmed while the pyre consumed itself. Then she understood, or thought she understood. When she touched the emperor's cursed scar, something had changed. Some connection had formed between her curse and his, between the barrenness everyone called divine punishment and the wound that burned with divine vengeance. The flames recognized her as something other than fuel. The pyre collapsed inward, leaving Cassia standing on scorched stone surrounded by ash and ember. The flames had consumed everything except her. The forum fell absolutely silent. Then someone in the crowd, the young servant girl, her voice high and clear, cried out, "The gods have judged her. She's innocent." The cry was taken up by others. "Innocent. The gods have spoken. She's blessed, not cursed." Brutus tried to regain control. "This proves nothing. It's trickery, some form of—" "The gods have spoken," someone else shouted, and now the crowd was turning, their fear transforming into awe, into the certainty that they'd witnessed something divine. Cassia stood motionless, still trying to process what had happened, when the hooded figure pushed through the crowd and leaped onto the platform. The emperor threw back his hood, revealing his face to the assembled masses. "The gods have indeed spoken," he said, his voice carrying across the forum. "They have shown that this girl is not cursed but blessed, that she carries divine favor, not corruption, and that the Senate," he turned to face Brutus directly, "has attempted to execute someone under the gods' protection." The political implications hit immediately. If the gods had saved Cassia, then opposing her meant opposing divine will. Brutus and his faction had bet everything on her burning, on proving the emperor's judgment flawed. Instead, they'd created a miracle that vindicated him. "Caesar," Brutus began, scrambling to salvage the situation, "we merely you sought to undermine my authority by forcing me to choose between mercy and power." The emperor interrupted. "You failed, and in failing, you've shown Rome exactly what happens when men try to substitute their judgment for the gods." He turned to the crowd. "This girl was rejected by everyone, sold repeatedly, called cursed and worthless. I bought her because I remembered what it felt like to be unwanted. And now the gods themselves have declared that she deserves protection, that mercy toward the rejected is not weakness, but divine will." The crowd roared approval. The political tide had turned completely. The emperor reached down and pulled Cassia to her feet, his hand warm against her ash-covered skin. "The rebellion within the Senate ends now," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "And you're going to have to get used to being called blessed instead of cursed." "I'm not blessed," Cassia whispered back. "I don't know what I am. You're someone the gods decided to save. That's enough." As they descended from the platform together, Brutus and his faction melting away in defeat, Cassia realized that everything had changed again. She was no longer the unwanted slave girl. She was no longer even the emperor's strange charity case. She was something new, something the gods had touched, something that had survived trial by flame, and Rome would never let her be invisible again. The weeks following the trial transformed Cassia's life in ways she could never have imagined. What had begun as survival, from auction block to palace chambers to a pyre in the forum, had become something else entirely. Rome now called her the Blessed One, the girl whom the gods had saved, the living proof that divine favor could elevate even the lowest among them. The Senate's rebellion collapsed overnight. Brutus and his closest allies were quietly exiled, their plot to undermine the emperor exposed and discredited. The remaining senators fell over themselves to pledge renewed loyalty, each trying to distance themselves from the failed coup. But the real change was in how people looked at Cassia. Servants who had avoided her now bowed when she passed. Citizens in the forum stopped to stare with reverence rather than contempt. Priests requested audiences to discuss what the gods had shown her in the flames. "You're uncomfortable," Emperor Aurelius observed one evening as they walked through the palace gardens. A full month had passed since the trial, and spring was giving way to summer. "I'm the same person I was before," Cassia said. "Nothing about me actually changed, but suddenly everyone treats me like I'm something sacred. You survived fire that should have killed you. That's not nothing. I don't even know why it happened. Was it because I touched your cursed scar? Is it connected to my own supposed curse? Or did the gods actually intervene?" She shook her head. "I have no answers, only more questions. Yet everyone expects me to be some kind of oracle." The emperor was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. "I've been thinking about what comes next, for both of us." "What do you mean?" "The Senate is cowed for now, but they'll recover. They'll find new ways to challenge my authority, new proxies to use. And you," he turned to face her directly, "you can't remain in this strange limbo forever. Neither slave nor free, neither servant nor citizen. Rome needs to understand what you are. And what am I? Someone I want beside me. not as a symbol or a political tool, but as a partner. He took her hands, his expression serious. "Cassia, I'm asking you to become my wife, to be Empress of Rome." Cassia stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious. I've spent a month watching you handle fame and scrutiny with the same quiet strength you showed when everyone rejected you. I've seen you remain yourself despite the pressure to become what others expect. That's rare. That's valuable. That's what I need in an empress. But I'm barren. An empress needs to provide heirs. I have nephews for succession. Rome will continue regardless of whether we have children." He stepped closer. "I'm not asking you to be empress because of what you can produce. I'm asking because of who you are. Because in a palace full of lies and manipulation you remain honest. Because you understand suffering and rejection in ways that make you compassionate rather than bitter. Because when given the choice between saving yourself or saving me from political disaster, you walked into the flames. That was courage. That was sacrifice. That was everything an empress should be." His grip on her hands tightened. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to pretend this is a romantic fairy tale. I'm asking if you'll stand beside me as I try to rule an empire that constantly tests whether mercy can coexist with power. Can you do that?" Cassia looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who'd bought her when no one else would, who'd given her safety without demanding payment, who'd tried to protect her even when it threatened his throne, who carried his own curse, his own rejection, his own understanding of what it meant to be unwanted. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I'll have enemies. People who think I'm not worthy, who resent my rise, who believe I've bewitched you despite what the gods showed. You'll have enemies regardless. At least as empress, you'll have power to defend yourself. And you? What do you get from this besides a controversial wife who can't give you children? I get someone who sees me as human rather than divine. Someone who understands that power is both gift and burden. Someone who survived their own trial by fire and emerged stronger." He smiled slightly. "And perhaps someone who can ease a cursed wound when it burns. That's not nothing." Cassia felt tears burning behind her eyes. A year ago, she'd stood on an auction platform being rejected by everyone, her price dropping lower with each failed bid. She'd accepted that her life would be lived in shadows, unwanted and invisible, until some owner finally worked her to death. Now the Emperor of Rome was asking her to marry him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place in the Forum, on the exact spot where Cassia had survived the flames. The symbolism was deliberate, the rejected slave girl becoming empress in the same location where the gods had declared her blessed. Thousands gathered to witness it, filling the Forum and spilling into surrounding streets. Cassia wore purple and gold, her dark hair arranged in elaborate braids woven with pearls. The bruises and scars from her years as a slave had faded, but she wore no makeup to hide the marks that remained. She was what she was, someone who had suffered and survived, and she wouldn't pretend otherwise. Emperor Aurelius stood waiting at the altar, dressed in full imperial regalia. When Cassia reached him, he took her hands and spoke loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "Before gods and Rome, I claim this woman as my wife, not because she is perfect, but because she is real. Not because she is powerful, but because she is strong. Not because she was wanted by everyone, but because I choose to want her." The priests blessed their union. The crowd cheered. And when the emperor placed the corona on Cassia's head, the golden crown that marked her as empress, she felt the weight of it, both literal and metaphorical. That evening, as they stood on the palace balcony looking out at Rome's lights, Cassia finally asked the question she'd been holding back. "Do you really think we can make this work? An emperor who tried to show mercy and got cursed for it, and a slave girl everyone called cursed until the gods decided otherwise?" "I think we have as good a chance as anyone," Aurelius replied. "We both understand what it costs to be rejected. We both know that mercy and power are hard to balance. We both survived our trials by fire. Yours, literal, mine, ongoing." He took her hand. "And we both know that the world tries to define us by our curses. Maybe together we can redefine what those curses mean." In the years that followed, poets would write about the emperor and his empress, the man who'd been sent away as an unwanted child, and the girl who'd been sold as a worthless slave. They'd speak of divine intervention, of curses broken and blessings granted, of trial by flame and redemption through mercy. Some of it was true, some was exaggeration, some was pure mythology. But the part that mattered most was simpler. Two people who'd been rejected by the world had found each other and chosen to build something together. Not perfect, not effortless, but real and lasting and worth fighting for. In the forum where Cassia had once stood on an auction block, her price dropping until even 15 denarii seemed too much, a statue was erected. It showed a woman standing in flames, untouched, her face calm and her hands open, not in supplication, but in acceptance. Below it, an inscription read, "She whom none wanted became the heart Rome needed. From rejection rose renewal." And every slave who passed that statue, every rejected child, every person deemed worthless by the world, looked up at it and understood. Curses were just stories people told until someone brave enough came along to rewrite the ending. Cassia had been that someone. And Rome, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, had learned to see worth where it had once seen only lack. That was the real miracle. Not the flames that parted, but the hearts that changed.